The grass on that low hill outside Boston was no longer green. By the time William Howe climbed it for the third time on that hot June afternoon, the slope was covered, in places almost paved, with the bodies of the men who had walked up it with him on the first two attempts, soldiers of the finest army in the world, lying where the American muskets had dropped them. On those first two climbs, Howe had been surrounded by his personal staff, the officers who carried his orders and stood at his shoulder. By the third climb, every single one of them had been killed or wounded. Howe reached the top almost alone, the only man of his staff still on his feet, and his white breeches, by some accounts, were soaked red to the knee from the work of walking through what was left of his own army. He took the hill. Let me say that plainly, because it matters for everything that follows. The British won the Battle of Bunker Hill. They drove the Americans off that ground, and they held it. By every rule of war, as it was understood at the time, by the only measure that went into the official report sent home, this was a British victory. And it may have been the single worst thing that happened to Britain in the entire war for America. The men who climbed that hill won it, and in the very act of winning it, they began to lose a continent. That is what this story is about. It is about the strange and terrible truth that there are some victories you cannot afford, and that winning, under the wrong circumstances, can cost you far more than losing ever would. There is an old phrase for this, and it comes from a king who lived more than 2,000 years before any of these men were born. His name was Pyrrhic, and he was a Greek king who fought the rising power of Rome in southern Italy. He beat the Romans twice in open battle, which was something almost nobody managed to do. But each time he beat them, he lost so many of his own best soldiers, men he could never replace so far from home, that after the second victory, when his officers came to him with their congratulations, he is supposed to have answered that one more such victory over the Romans, and he would be completely ruined. He had won the battle and lost the war in the same afternoon, because the Romans could replace their dead, and he could not. From that king we get the term a Pyrrhic victory, a win so expensive that it does the work of a defeat. Hold that idea in your hand, and look again at what happened outside Boston. The arithmetic of Bunker Hill is the whole point. So let me give it to you cleanly before we go back and watch it unfold. Of the roughly 2,200 British soldiers who went up that hill, more than 1,000 were shot. 226 were killed, and another 828 were wounded. That is close to half of the entire attacking force, struck down in a single afternoon, to capture a small hill that they could, in truth, have simply walked around. It was the bloodiest single day the British Army would suffer in the whole 8 years of the war. And they suffered it at the very beginning, in their first real battle, against an enemy they had walked onto the field expecting to scatter like sheep. And the raw number, terrible as it is, hides the part that truly mattered, the part that turned an expensive victory into a strategic catastrophe. Of all those British casualties, an extraordinary share were officers. Something like 90 officers were killed or wounded on that one hillside. The captains and majors and lieutenants who were the entire nervous system of an 18th century army. We will come back to why that particular loss was so much heavier than it sounds. For now, simply hold the shape of it in your mind. The British won, and the winning gutted them, and it gutted them precisely in the places that could not grow back. To understand how they ended up charging that hill at all, you have to picture the strange situation around Boston in the early summer of 1775. The shooting had already started. 2 months earlier, in April, British troops had marched out to the towns of Lexington and Concord to seize rebel weapons, and the countryside had risen against them, and they had been shot at from behind every wall and tree on the long, bloody road back into the city. After that, the militia of New England did not go home. They stayed. Thousands of farmers and tradesmen, with their own muskets, gathered in a great rough ring around Boston, and they sat down, and they bottled the British army up inside the town. This was an embarrassing position for the most powerful empire on earth to be in, penned into a single port by what the British High Command honestly believed was an armed rabble. And in May, 3 more generals arrived by ship to help fix the problem, men whose names come up again and again in this war: William Howe, Henry Clinton, John Burgoyne. They joined the commander already there, General Thomas Gage, and together they looked at the map and made their plans. The contempt in their letters home is striking even now. One British officer wrote that their generals had expected to punish a mob, not to fight troops who would actually stand and look them in the face. That single assumption, that the Americans simply would not stand, was about to be tested on a hillside, and it was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The plan itself was sound enough. Around Boston there were pieces of high ground, and whoever held the high ground could put cannon on it and command the harbor and the town below. The British decided to break out and seize those heights before the rebels could. But the rebels heard about it, and rather than wait to be pushed off the hills, they decided to get there first. On the night of the 16th of June, in the dark, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 American militiamen marched quietly onto the Charlestown Peninsula, a tongue of land sticking out into the water across from Boston. They had been ordered to fortify a rise called Bunker Hill. For reasons that men have argued about ever since, their commander on the spot, a tough Massachusetts colonel named William Prescott, went forward instead to a lower hill, Breed's Hill, which sat closer to Boston and was easier for the enemy guns to reach, but which was also far more provoking, because a fort there pointed almost like a loaded pistol at the town. And then these amateurs did something that should not have been possible. Guided by an engineer named Richard Gridley, working in near silence, so that the British sentries across the water would not hear them, they dug. All night long, in the dark, they threw up an earthwork redoubt, a square fort of packed soil with walls about 6 feet high and perhaps 160 feet to a side. They dug a breastwork running off from one corner, and down toward the river, a stubborn line of New Hampshire men under a frontier soldier named John Stark built a low stone wall along the beach and stuffed a rail fence with hay. When the sun came up on the 17th, the British in Boston looked across the water and saw, where the evening before there had been nothing but an empty hill, a fortress that had grown out of the ground overnight, full of men who were not supposed to be capable of any of this. A British naval officer is said to have been so astonished that he could scarcely believe what his telescope was showing him. The guns of the warships in the harbor opened up at once, hurling iron at the little fort, and the men inside flinched and kept digging. One young man was killed by a cannonball early in the morning, and the sight of it badly shook the others, and Prescott did the only thing a leader can do in such a moment. He climbed up onto the top of the wall, in full view of the enemy gunners, and walked along it slowly and calmly, so that every one of his men could see that their colonel was not afraid. They steadied, and they stayed. In the early afternoon, the British came across the water in their boats, rank after rank of them, and landed on the peninsula below the American position. They were a magnificent and frightening sight, and they knew it. These were professional soldiers in bright red coats, with polished bayonets and the discipline of years behind them, forming into neat lines at the bottom of the slope. To make matters worse for the men in the redoubt, British guns set fire to the town of Charlestown below them, and several hundred buildings went up in flame and black smoke, an entire town burning as a backdrop to the battle. The message was not subtle. This is what resistance costs. General Howe, who led the assault in person, looked up at the American line and saw what he took to be farmers cowering behind a mud wall. He formed his men and sent them forward up the hill, in the old style, in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, expecting that the sheer disciplined terror of a British advance with the bayonet would send the rebels running before the two sides ever met, as it almost always had. The redcoats marched up through grass that came to their knees, over fences and around brick kilns, in the heavy June heat, loaded down with their packs, into a silence that should have warned them, because the Americans did not fire. Their commanders had given an order, and whether the exact famous words were ever truly spoken is one of those things that history has lost in legend. But the substance of the order was to hold, to wait, to throw away not one single precious ball until the enemy was so close that no shot could miss. The men were desperately short of powder, and they could not afford to waste it at long range. So they waited while the red lines came on. 40 yards, 30 yards, close enough to see the faces under the hats. And then the order came to fire, and the whole American line erupted at once. The effect was butchery. Whole ranks of British soldiers were swept away in an instant. Down by the water, where the light infantry tried to rush along the narrow beach and turn the American flank, John Stark's New Hampshire marksmen shot them down so fast and so completely that the sand was left heaped with bodies in a matter of minutes, and the survivors broke and ran. Up the slope, the grenadiers and the line companies walked into volley after volley and were torn to pieces. The neat red lines came apart. Officers shouting their orders made perfect targets, and the American riflemen had been told to look for them in particular, to aim for the men with the fine coats and the swords and the gold lace. The first British assault simply collapsed and streamed back down the hill, leaving the grass behind it covered with the fallen. A sensible enemy might have stopped there. Howe did not stop. He reformed his shaken men at the bottom of the hill and sent them up a second time, over the bodies of the very friends who had gone up with them the first time. You have to picture the discipline that took, and the horror of it. Men stepping over and around their own dead and dying to march straight back into the exact fire that had just destroyed them. And the same thing happened again. The Americans held until the range was murderously close, and then they fired, and the second assault was shattered just as the first had been. Around General Howe, his officers were falling one after another after another. He wrote later that there was a moment in that battle, as he stood almost alone, with his army melting away around him, that he had never felt before in his whole life, and would never forget. This was a man who had seen hard fighting in his time. The thing that shook him to the core was not any danger to himself. It was the sight of his beautiful regiments being annihilated by people he had been taught all his life to despise. Twice now the British had gone up the hill, and twice they had been thrown back down it with appalling loss. By the rules Howe had grown up with, by everything his long career had taught him, this was already a defeat. Any honest account of the afternoon, stopped at that point, would have called it an American triumph and a British disaster. But the battle was not over, because the one thing the Americans were running out of was the one thing that decided everything. Before I tell you how the hill finally fell, let me quickly say this. If you are finding something useful in the way these old battles open up into something larger than themselves, the single most helpful thing you can do is subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It costs you nothing, and it puts these stories in front of more people who would otherwise never find them. That is all. Now, back to the hill, and to the cruel detail that turned the whole afternoon around. The Americans were running out of gunpowder. They had never had much to begin with, and after two great volleys that had broken two great assaults, the men in the redoubt were down to their last rounds. scraping the bottoms of their powder horns, some of them with nothing left to load at all. Howe, whatever else you may say about him, understood his trade, and he sensed what was happening. For the third assault, he changed everything. He concentrated his men into a tighter mass, told them to rely on the bayonet and not to stop and fire, and sent them straight at the redoubt. This time, when the Americans pulled their triggers, only a thin and ragged volley answered. And then, nothing at all. And the British came over the walls. What happened inside that little fort was savage and short. The Americans had few bayonets of their own, and men with empty muskets fought British regulars with clubbed rifle butts and rocks and bare fists in the smoke and the dust. They could not hold. Prescott gave the order to retreat, and his men fought their way out and back across the narrow neck of land to the mainland, and most of the American dead of that whole day fell there, in that desperate withdrawal, cut down as they pulled back. Among them was one man whose loss struck the Patriots harder than any other, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the most important leaders of the entire rebellion. A physician who had only days before been made a general, but who had come to the hill and fought as an ordinary volunteer with a musket in the redoubt, was shot through the head in the final moments. The British took the hill, and the body of Joseph Warren went into a shallow grave, and the most powerful empire on earth had its victory. So they had won. The flag they wanted flew over the hill they wanted. And then the counting began. And as the reports came in through the evening, the victory curdled in their hands. More than 1,000 of their men were down, close to half of everyone who had made the assault. It was, as I told you at the start, the worst single day the British Army would have in the whole war, and they would go on fighting for 8 more years. The men who had expected to punish a mob had been bled nearly white by farmers standing behind a wall of dirt. The reactions of the British commanders tell you everything you need to know. General Clinton, who had watched the slaughter from across the water in Boston, wrote in his diary that night a single sentence that has outlived almost everything else any of them ever said. He called it a dear-bought victory, and he added that another such victory would have ruined them. One of Britain's own generals, on the very evening of a win, looking honestly at the bill, was saying in plain words that a few more victories like this one would destroy the British Army in America. That is the voice of a man who can see that the scoreboard says he won and the ledger says he is finished. On the American side, the mood was the exact mirror image. An American general named Nathaniel Greene heard the casualty figures and said that he only wished they could sell the British another hill at the same price. He understood at once what had happened. His side had lost the ground and won the exchange. And General Gage, the overall British commander, sat down to write to London. And the man who had once dismissed the rebels as nothing was now forced to admit, in his own hand, that these people were not the contemptible rabble that so many had supposed them to be, that they had shown a spirit and a skill against the British that they had never once shown, even when fighting alongside them against the French years before. The whole comfortable assumption that this rebellion could be slapped down by professionals in an afternoon had died on that hill, in the minds of the very men who had been sent to do the slapping. I promised you that we would come back to the officers, because that is the detail that turns this from a bloody afternoon into a hinge of history. 90 or so officers killed and wounded does not sound, at first hearing, like the kind of thing that decides a war. So let me explain why. In this particular army, in this particular century, it came so close to being fatal. An 18th century army was not like a modern one. It ran entirely on its officers. The ordinary soldiers were drilled to do almost nothing at all on their own initiative. They loaded and fired and marched and halted and turned on command. And the commands came from the officers, and only from the officers. A captain or a major was the product of many long years of service and experience, and there were never very many of them to begin with. You could find another farm boy to carry a musket on almost any street corner in Britain. You could not conjure up a trained captain out of thin air. And this army was 3,000 miles and many weeks of hard sailing away from the country that made its officers. Every lieutenant shot dead on Breed's Hill was a man who could not be replaced for the better part of a year, if he could be replaced at all. And the Americans, whether by deliberate instruction or simply because a man on horseback in a gold-laced coat is the easiest and most tempting target on any battlefield, had killed and crippled them in extraordinary numbers. They had reached right into the British Army and torn out a piece of its brain. The privates who died could be replaced from the slums and the prisons and the press gangs. The officers could not be, and their absence would be felt in clumsy, hesitant, badly led actions for years to come. The British had bought themselves a hill, and they had paid for it with the one part of their army that no amount of money could quickly buy back. But the very worst cost of all was not measured in bodies at all. It was in the lessons that each side carried away from that hill, because the two armies learned opposite things from the same afternoon, and both of those lessons worked against Britain. The Americans learned that they could do it before Bunker Hill. The great open question, the thing that kept thoughtful men awake at night, was whether ordinary colonial militia could ever truly stand against trained British regulars in a stand-up battle. Lexington and Concord had been running fights from behind cover. This was something else entirely. This was the rebels holding a line and breaking, not once, but twice, the finest infantry in the world in an open trial of strength. The news of it ran through the 13 colonies like fire through dry summer grass. Men who had doubted now believed. The cause had been handed its proof that the empire could be hurt, badly, by people exactly like them. And that belief was worth more than the hill itself 10 times over. A rebellion that thinks it can actually win is a very different and far more dangerous thing than a rebellion that is merely angry. And the British learned to be afraid. Not afraid in the sense of cowardice, for these were brave men who had just proven it beyond any question, but afraid in a deeper and more lasting way. They learned that hurling their soldiers straight at Americans dug in on high ground was a reliable way to destroy their own army. They had paid an unbearable price to learn that lesson, and they were never going to forget it. And that lesson, the caution that Bunker Hill burned into the British High Command, is exactly where the victory quietly turned into the thing that would lose them the war. Watch what happens next, because this is the heart of the whole argument. Just over a year later, in the late summer of 1776, that same General Howe, now risen to be the British commander-in-chief, faced George Washington's army on Long Island, outside New York. And here, Howe did almost everything right. He outmaneuvered Washington brilliantly, swung around his flank, and drove the entire American army back into a corner on Brooklyn Heights, pinned against the East River with their backs to the water and nowhere left to run. Washington's whole force, which is to say the whole revolution, was trapped in front of him and waiting to be destroyed. And Howe stopped. With the American army at his mercy, he declined to storm their entrenchments. He chose instead to dig in and to approach them slowly and safely by formal siege, rather than send his men charging once more at dug-in Americans on high ground. He had learned, on Breed's Hill, exactly what that kind of charge cost, and he could not bring himself to pay it a second time. So he waited. And in the night, under a providential fog, Washington ferried his entire army across the river to safety, and the revolution slipped away to fight another day. Historians still argue about how much of Howe's caution traced directly back to that one hill, and it is only fair to say it was not the single reason he hesitated. But the men of that time had little doubt that the ghost of Bunker Hill rode on Howe's shoulder, and that he had become a careful, slow, reluctant commander, precisely because he had once seen with his own eyes what eager assaults did to a British army. And this became the pattern of the entire war in the North. Again and again, the British had Washington's small and fragile army within their reach, and again they failed to close their hand and crush it, choosing the cautious path, the safe path, and letting it escape to recover and recruit and fight on. A bolder, more reckless command might well have ended the rebellion in a single hard afternoon in those early years, while it was still weak. But the British command was not bold anymore. It had been cured of its boldness on the 17th of June, 1775. The hill they had won taught them the hesitation that, more than any single defeat they ever suffered, gave the revolution the room and the time it needed to survive long enough to win. So consider what that hill actually bought, and what it actually cost. And notice how completely the two accounts disagree. On the ledger of the battle, the official one, the one that went home in the dispatch, Britain won. They took the ground. They could write the word victory, and it was, narrowly, true. On every other ledger that mattered, the one for the officer corps, the one for the confidence of the enemy, the one for the nerve of their own generals, the one that quietly records who is winning the actual war, Britain lost, and lost badly, and lost in ways that could never afterward be undone. The scoreboard said one thing. Everything underneath the scoreboard said the opposite. And it is what lies underneath the scoreboard that decides wars. This is the trap of the costly victory, and it is in many ways more dangerous than an ordinary defeat for one simple reason. A defeat tells you, clearly and painfully, that something is wrong and has to change. A victory tells you that you were right and that you should go and do it all again. The British generals on that hill got the worst of both worlds at once. They suffered the losses of a crushing defeat, and they received the congratulations of a victory. And the single word victory in the report blunted the alarm that those losses should have been screaming. They were applauded for the very thing that had nearly destroyed them. And this is the part that reaches well beyond Boston, beyond the muskets and the red coats, into your life and mine, because the human mind does strange things with a win that it never does with a loss, and they are worth naming out loud. The first is that a victory ends the argument. When a plan fails, everyone who ever had doubts about it speaks up. The decision gets pulled apart and examined, and lessons get dragged out of the wreckage. When the very same plan succeeds, even at ruinous and reckless cost, the doubters fall silent, because nobody wants to argue with a winner. The people who could have warned you have just been handed a result that appears to say they were wrong all along. The costly win does not merely fail to teach you the lesson, it actively buries the lesson, and it buries the credibility of the people who were trying to teach it to you. The second is that a victory rewards the method that produced it, no matter how terrible that method was. Howe took the hill with a head-on frontal assault, and so the head-on frontal assault was, technically, a thing that worked. Success stamps its approval on whatever you happen to do to win, even if what you did was close to insane. Even if you survived only by pure luck and the thinnest of margins. We are built to repeat what gets rewarded, and a victory rewards everything that led up to it, including all the parts that very nearly got you killed. And the third is the cruelest of all, and it is the one the British never understood until it was far too late to matter. Sometimes the act of beating someone is the exact thing that makes them unbeatable. The British did not merely fail to crush the rebellion on that hill. By forcing the rebels to pay a price, they turned out to be willing and able to pay. And by showing them that they could inflict a far heavier price in return, The British transformed a loose and doubtful uprising into a movement that suddenly believed in itself. There are enemies, and there are situations where winning the fight in front of you is precisely how you lose the war behind it, because the winning is the very thing that hardens the other side into something that will never, ever quit. And of course, none of this was ever really only about a hill near Boston. You have seen this same shape yourself, even if you never had a name to put on it. It is the company that wins a vicious price war against a rival and then discovers it has bankrupted itself in the doing of it, having sold 100,000 things at a loss just to stop the other fellow from selling them. It is the lawsuit you win after 3 long years and a small fortune in fees, standing in the courtroom victorious and poorer and older and somehow emptier than if you had simply walked away on the first day. It is the argument you win with someone you love, where you are completely right and you prove it beyond all doubt. And then you watch something between the two of you go quiet and cold that somehow never quite warms up again. The word stamped on all of these things is victory. The reality of them is loss, wearing a victory's coat. And there is a strange comfort hidden on the other side of this, which is worth carrying away with you. If a victory can secretly be a defeat, then a defeat can just as secretly be a victory. The Americans lost that hill, and the losing of it taught them that they could win the war. A loss that teaches you something real, that hardens you, that shows you exactly what you are made of, can be worth more in the end than a win that only flatters you and tells you to keep right on doing the thing that is quietly bleeding you to death. The question to ask yourself, on the day you win something, is never simply, did I win? It is, what did the winning cost me? And what did it teach me? And what did it teach the person standing across from me? The hill is quiet now, and it carries a name it never quite earned. There is a tall stone monument standing on the Charlestown Peninsula today, a gray granite needle pointing straight up at the sky, and it is called the Bunker Hill Monument, even though almost all of the real fighting and dying took place a little way off from it, on Breed's Hill, where the redoubt actually stood. People climb the long stair inside it on summer afternoons and look out across Boston, and the city has long since grown up and over the killing ground, so that streets and houses now cover the slopes where the grenadiers fell in their rows. Somewhere beneath that grown-over ground is where they laid Joseph Warren, the doctor who did not have to be on that hill at all, who held a general's commission in his pocket and chose instead to stand in the redoubt with a musket like any other man, and who paid for that choice with his life at 34 years of age. He never knew that his side would go on to win the war he died at the very start of. He knew only, in his last hour, that a great many British soldiers had come up that hill, and that a great many of them had not walked back down it. He could not have known that the sheer scale of what his side did that day, the terrible price they made the British pay for one patch of dirt, would go on echoing through the minds of British generals for years, and would help, in the end, to lose them the continent. So when you find yourself about to celebrate some hard-won victory of your own, by all means go ahead and celebrate it, but spend one quiet moment alone with the bill. Count not just the ground you took, but what the taking of it took out of you, and whether it left you genuinely stronger or only let you call yourself the winner, while the things that actually decide the larger war all slid silently the other way. Some hills are worth almost any price you could name. And some hills, once you have honestly counted the cost of climbing them, you would have been far wiser to walk around. If this story showed you something you had not quite thought about before, the kindest thing you can do for me is press that like button and subscribe, so that the next one finds its way to you when it arrives. There is a great deal more of this still to come, and if you would rather not stop here just yet, you do not have to. There is another video waiting for you on the screen right now, one that I think follows on from this one rather well. Go ahead and start it whenever you are ready, and I will see you over there in the next story.